There are several items I'm going to cover this afternoon. First is a focus on our economic and fiscal outlook. And then I have an update for you on the American Rescue Plan Act as part of that presentation. And I think the board is going to discuss potential budget guidance with me. Also, I have with me today the chief of police and deputy chief, and also the director and deputy director of the Department of Human Services to talk about some personnel issues and funding challenges there. And also I have the Elizabeth Hardy and Emily Garrett here to talk about the census results. And we have a update on where we are with COVID, which I think is very important. So as to the economic and fiscal outlook, like last year, I'm sharing a very preliminary look right now at the September board meeting about next year's budget. And that's a little bit earlier than we normally do, but considering the outlook that we have and discussions that we have upcoming on the American Rescue Plan, I thought it was important that we get this information out there now. So I'm going to turn it over to Emily Hughes from the Department of Management and Finance, and she will give us an overview of the fiscal year 2023 budget outlook. Emily?
Ms. Hughes? I think
you're muted.
You may be on mute. We know because each of us does it once per meeting.
Apologies. Thank you very much. I have a few slides to share about the county manager's fiscal 2023 budget outlook. So as we look forward and begin to prepare for the FY 2023 budget, the good news is that we're better off fiscally than we were at this time last year. Some of the revenues are starting to recover, and we see continued strength in our residential real estate market. Also, at this time last year, we did not know the scale of the federal relief. The ARPA funding available to Arlington, together with other one-time funding sources, allowed us to balance the FY22 budget without taking significant cuts that would impact services. ARPA allowed us to restore $3.8 million worth of county services with that one-time funding, in addition to the $13 to $15 million of other one-time funding that balanced this year's budget. We're likely to need to continue to use one-time funding in FY23 as our revenue is still recovering and to offset cost pressures, including compensation for our workforce and other potential cost pressures, including Metro, schools, and the impact of inflation on our contracts. Next, I'm going to share a little bit more information on how our tax receipts are looking and what we anticipate for FY23. So fortunately, we are seeing continued recovery in a number of the tax sources, and by FY23, we anticipate a return to normalcy for most other non-tax sources. Our consumption taxes that are received monthly, including sales, meals, car rental, and hotel tax, have been impacted perhaps more than any other revenue source. You'll see that the graph on the left here combines those sources by fiscal year. In our last normal year of fiscal 2019, these taxes together made up just over 10% of total general fund taxes. In FY 2021, each of them was down significantly when compared with FY19. Sales tax was down 12%, meals down 33%, car rental down 46%, and hotel tax was down 77% in FY21 compared to 19. But in recent months, we've begun to see some consistent recovery in these sources. For example, in July, meals tax receipts were just 9% lower than the same month in FY19, and sales tax in July actually showed growth of 7% over July sales tax receipts in FY19. Unfortunately, our hotel tax in July was still lagging FY19 revenues by 50%. You can see on the graph on the left that when we look at all three of these together, we expect revenues to be up 20% over FY21 actuals in FY 2022, and that in FY 2023 will be 41% better than FY 21 was. So while taxes are looking better than this time last year, they're still not quite back to more normal levels. On the other hand, our residential real estate market continues to show strength. Although we will not know until later in the calendar year how much residential real estate values have increased, preliminary sales data shows positive growth. The graph on the right shows data from MLS on the number of home sales. The blue line is all sales, the yellow line is attached homes, and the blue line detached homes. In recent months, you can see that the activity in the market has been greater than in 2020 and in 2019. Similarly, home prices have been increasing over prior years this calendar year. In June and July, there was some leveling off, and many sources are suggesting a return to more normal levels of market activity and price increases. But prices and sales that we've seen this calendar year will impact the assessments of residential properties in January. Given the market activity that we've seen in the residential market, we are anticipating positive growth in residential property assessments. The chart on the left shows our expected positive growth in residential assessments in red. You see on the far right that the red bar is the FY22 anticipated increase in residential assessments. But potentially offsetting this anticipated growth in residential assessments, we're anticipating pressure in the commercial sector. As we've mentioned in previous budget conversations, there's continued uncertainty in the office real estate market. The chart on the right highlights the increase in vacancy rates that we're seeing in the county, and that's one factor in assessed values of properties in this sector. There's also the continued uncertainty of the return to the workplace and changes to how businesses are evaluating the need for physical office space. For hotels, which are also in that commercial sector of real estate assessments, we continue to see slow recovery in tourism, and we're also anticipating costs as a result of inflation and interest rates. So together, all the commercial sectors, office, hotels, apartments, and retail, make up about 47% of our real estate tax base, and real estate taxes are over 70% of total tax revenues. So while we expect pressure on assessments to impact FY23, we are hoping to see continued recovery in all sectors of the commercial market, because Arlington's commercial real estate market really is a key underpinning of the county's diversified financial tax base. As I mentioned earlier, we're in a better fiscal position and we have a more solid outlook than we had this time last year. But similar to last year, there are a number of funding priorities and economic uncertainties to navigate in the FY23 budget. These economic uncertainties will impact the tax base, but more importantly, our community. We expect there will be some level of continued pandemic response to support both the health and welfare of our community, as there are lingering economic impacts on individuals and businesses. Also, in order for us to maintain delivery of high quality government services, we face a real challenge in employee recruitment and retention. We will need to continue to carefully navigate the pressures on our revenues and the expenditure needs to be responsive, but also to be fiscally responsible, shoring up our budget with an appropriate level of one-time resources until we see more revenue recovery. There are a number of things that are going to impact the final budget the manager brings before the county board in the February timeframe. First, real estate assessments are going to be finalized in early January, setting the largest of our revenue sources for fiscal 23. We're going to be getting additional data points each month on sales, meals, and hotel taxes that are going to help us set our best estimates for fiscal 23 revenue for these sources. We'll be getting department input on the impact of inflation and other contractual cost pressures, as well as input on the needs related to the economic and pandemic support that's going to be needed. At this point, our assumptions for the fiscal 23 budget include that real estate assessments will be increasing 1 to 2%, and other revenue will be up 5 to 10%. The manager's forecast includes compensation increases and assumes that non-personnel expenses are increasing between 3 and 5%. To close the budget gap, the manager and the board have the typical levers of utilizing one-time funds, revenue changes, and expenditure reductions or realignments. One additional input to the manager's budget will be the county's support for schools. Revenue sharing agreement lays out a 47% share of local tax revenues to support schools as the starting point for the fiscal 23 budget. Initial estimates for FY 2023 are that ongoing revenue will be 4 to 5% higher than the FY 22 adopted budget for schools. It's important to remember that the county provides support to schools beyond that revenue sharing agreement as well, through school health nurses and services, crossing guards, DHS programs that help children and families, athletic fields, and maintaining safe routes to schools. This graph shows a general timeline from now until the fiscal year starts next summer. We're working with the county manager's communications office to lay out how we can engage with the public and they can engage with us over the next few months. This will probably include both sharing information through videos or other means, as well as opportunities for online feedback with stakeholders. And that will conclude my presentation on the FY 2023 budget outlook.
Thank you, Ms. Hughes. Very much appreciated. I don't know if colleagues have questions. We can also turn back to the manager for the revenue forecast and ARPA discussion if colleagues do not. I don't see. Go ahead, Mr. Karantonis.
I mean, first of all, thank you. That was very comprehensive, and it's actually a great experience to start the September with budget season. So on the vacancy rate, I saw a projection up to 19.4%. So do we have any idea why we project that? I mean, what is the underlying assumption?
Yes, so that actually is not a projection. That is the current vacancy rate. And Mr. Tucker, who is here, might want to step up and offer some thoughts on that because he was feeling left alone in the back there. But he can give you an explanation, I think, of just a short summary of what he sees the future trend over the next quarter or two, something like that.
Mr. Tucker.
Good evening, County Board, and thank you, Mr. Manager. Currently, yes, the vacancy rate is hovering in the neighborhood of 19 to 20%. We have seen about a 5% increase since the time the pandemic has started. Some of that we knew was coming with the vacation of spaces by some of the federal tenants who had given notice a few years back. But similarly, we've seen a significant number of subletting of spaces on the market. That gets factored into the vacancy rate, as I understand its calculation. Also, the normal activity that we would see in terms of industry renewing new leases, that has slowed down. Many companies have put that on pause until they have more predictability about what's going to happen in the market. And also those clients who were looking at the market, many of them are still considering the market, but they are delaying location decisions. So I think all of those things together contribute to the increase in vacancy. And I don't have my notes in front of me, but if my memory serves me correct, every 1% of vacancy represents about $3.5 million to the tax revenue to the county budget. And I do believe that as we exit the pandemic, we will see some recovery there. I think it'll take some time, but I think the communities that will be best poised to rebound and have an economic recovery will be those that incorporate some flexibility into things like uses, considering there will be businesses that don't survive the pandemic. And so when we have those vacant spaces, how do we plan to reuse them, reconsider them, repurpose them, think about industries that we're seeing now that are hybrids of things that may not have existed as far as how we define traditional business uses in the past. And so wanted to make sure that we're prepared to do that. And I think we are very pleased that during the planning work session last week, our planning department is working with AED and looking at some of those, how we consider everything from ground floor uses to upper floor uses, and particularly in many of our office buildings. So happy to answer any specific questions that you might have. But
thank you, Mr. Tucker. That was very informative.
Thank you, Mr. Tucker. I know this is a source of focus of each member of the board, and we're not asking you to single-handedly say that there wouldn't be any rise in the office vacancy rates in the fallout from the pandemic, but your thoughtful remarks are really helpful as we think about the fiscal outlook for the coming year. So I don't have any other questions. I think it'd be back to the manager for maybe a revenue forecast and ARPA discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Tucker. So I wanted to move on to the American Rescue Plan Act discussion. And what we're going to do is share some guiding principles on the use of the funds. A number of our sister jurisdictions took different approaches when it came to ARPA funding. And the reason why we have waited until now was we were waiting for a few things. One was for some clear guidance from the federal government on the appropriate use and the eligibility restrictions that surrounded rescue plan funding. The other was to see how the Commonwealth did when the General Assembly and Senate got together in August and made funding decisions on their use of ARPA funds. And so, frankly, I was pretty disappointed with what the state did as far as whether they put any bundles of money together for the use of localities. And with a better sense of that, I wanted to go ahead with the presentation and remind the community of the funds we received and suggest a potential approach using some principles. But I will be back to you next month with very specific allocations, except in a few circumstances that I think you're familiar with. So I think someone is going to put up the slides. I think this is going to work magically. Okay,
There we go.
thank you. If we go on to the next slide. In March of this year, President Biden signed a $1.9 trillion ARPA legislation, and the main purpose of that is to provide states and localities with funds for fiscal recovery. Arlington's allocation out of that $1.9 trillion is $46 million, and that comes in two equal allotments. The first one we received in May of this year, the second one we receive in May of next year. And those funds must be obligated, the first tranche by the end of 2024 and the second by the end of 2026. It's also important to note that there are within the $1.9 trillion, there are a number of other sources of funding streams that we've been paying close attention to. Arlington residents have benefited from about $7 million in rental assistance above the funds I've identified, the $23 million. And also, there's been close to $10 million that has assisted us in some of our transit programs. And in addition, our colleagues at Arlington Public Schools separately have been allocated close to $19 million. We go on to the next slide. Michael Stewart, who's our Deputy Director of the Department of Management and Finance, is probably one of the, has studied and really knows the details of the permitted use of these funds, and they fall essentially into four buckets. The first is to support COVID-19 response efforts. The second is to replace lost revenue for governments. That is not mean anything goes, but it's a fairly broad interpretation of what revenue we have foregone that we might be able to use these funds to replace. It's another set of factors where the funding can be addressed is to address the systemic challenges that have come about with the way the pandemic has really affected our community. In many cases, there's been inequity in the way those effects have hit our community. And then also, finally, supporting economic stabilization for businesses and households. Let's go on to the next slide. So the 23 million, that's the number to focus on. So in April, the county board, knowing that we had, remember, we got the money in March, you've already allocated $3.8 million of that 23 million. And that $3.8 million was used to restore some budget cuts that had been built into the proposed fiscal 22 budget. That $3.8 million went to reopen our Cherrydale and Glen Carlin libraries, to reopen our Department of Parks and Recreation community centers, to provide some funding for our tourism staff to make sure they could stay on board since the tourism industry and our hotel revenues had plummeted, and also to provide some maintenance funding needed for some of our parks. That essentially leaves available for further conversation $19.2 million. In April, you put together a number of factors that you asked us to focus on how to use the $19.2 million. They're all addressed there in the box. Public health needs, obviously, number one on the list. Also responding to community housing and hunger needs, and then the assistance to small business and nonprofits. And the board did go out of its way to say, as funding became available, employee compensation should be a priority. So, with that $19.2 million, you'll see that we've gone back and done some review of the situation. And as of right now, we estimate that of that $19.2 million, we'll need approximately $5 million to do our first responsibility, which is vaccines, testing, tracing, and the assistance for eviction prevention, food security, rental assistance, congregate care support. That's an estimate of the first chunk of that $19.2 million. This board on Saturday also took action to set aside $2 million for the Grant 2.0 program to support small businesses. People at the time may have been wondering, and I know the board was explicit about it, but this is the source of that $2 million in funding. So what I'm about to talk to you about is principles that we think should apply to what is remaining out of that $19.2 million or $12.2 million. Next slide. So here are some of the guiding principles. You can call them buckets, call them circles with nice graphics in them. These are the areas we think that we should be focused on trying to direct those funds and weighing the values and focus on the vulnerable in our community in those areas that would be most benefited by the funds. And I'm not going to go through each of the graphics there. You see what they are. Let's go on to the next slide. This is actually important. This is a chart that we're using and we hope that the community will take a look at, which is that I've described everything in that first column, the $5 million for pandemic response, the restoration of the 22 cuts, the grants, and then the $12.2 million that's available. Now, that is the first tranche of $23 million. Now, that second tranche of $23 million, which I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking on, there is right now arguably already a claim on that. Since we've used close to $4 million to restore services, those services are ongoing services. They include libraries, recreation centers, and they will need to continue. So to that extent, there's already a claim on that second tranche of money, and that $4 million or $4.2 million number we have there is essentially the $3.8 million number inflated into the out years. So let's take a look at the next slide. We have some general ideas we have with these concepts of the kinds of things that might be included in each bucket. For example, housing assistance, we've talked about eviction prevention. Workforce sustainability. We will, and I will be talking about retention bonuses in critical staffing areas. Equity in disadvantaged neighborhoods. We'll also be talking a little bit about a crisis intervention center function we have at the Department of Human Services. And then also child care options. Interestingly, this came up a little bit. There was an article in the paper over the weekend. Almost all of these buckets are affected by one item, which is just the absolute difficulty of recruiting and maintaining staff for our child care centers and also for the county and all our businesses. That has been one of the primary drivers of some of the economic dislocation we've been seeing. Also for transit and transportation, we're very actively considering, and I seek your feedback on the possibility of waiving revenue that we might receive from students who use art. In other words, saying that all Arlington Public School students who pay any bus fare, we would give them a pass on that. We would subsidize that. So free transit for students. And then also looking selectively at those individuals who use transit to see not everyone, but those who are economically disadvantaged, giving them a pass on having to pay for transit. And then you can see also some additional focus on workforce development programs. So there is that $12.2 million. There's a mix of items there. We've gone back to a number of departments and asked for their ideas. I will come back to you in October with some very specific recommendations on the allocation of those funds. And it is my suggestion that those allocation ideas sit out in the community and that the board take action on a final adoption of those in November. Now, there will be an exception to that I'll talk about after this presentation. So let me summarize the next steps. We have in October, I'll be presenting proposed allocations of the rescue plan. Those of you at home who are budget nerds will know that that's also the time when we come to you with closeout of fiscal 22 and allocations of the one-time dollars available then. I think upcoming, the board is going to discuss the possibility of budget guidance and adopting that in October. We will have a very active community feedback we're going to seek on any of the proposals we put out there, and then final adoption of all those allocations in November, and saving the second tranche for later. So that is my brief, I hope, hopefully informative presentation on the rescue plan. I'm happy to take any questions at this point, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Schwartz. Very informative, provides context. We'll go to Mr. Dorsey first. I will just flag for the clerk, eventually, I think we'll want to just show briefly the draft budget guidance, but that'll be after questions. So go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Schwartz. Excellent presentation. But as you think about the FY22 budget holes and potentially using the second tranche to fill those in the remaining years of eligibility, help me understand your thinking in terms of how that marries with the projected rate of overall revenue recovery for the county, because a significant number of those budget cuts were from what had previously been generally ongoing operations of the county, which we would expect to return in the form of being fully funded in your budgets once we return to economic health.
And so that question points out something that I did not, and I should have emphasized on the slide. As we're talking about rescue plan funds, that is just a subset of what will go into the full budget. When the board adopted the fiscal 22 budget, built in there was approximately $12 or $13 million of additional one-time funds used to support that budget. So what you have pointed out is we run the risk of building a budget that is relying on a higher percentage of one-time funds. I think in the presentation you heard from Emily Hughes, you see that there's strength beyond what we had anticipated last April and additional ongoing revenue coming in. I'm fairly confident that we will be able to fill most of that gap that was created in one-time funds, but not all of it. So that is the reason why I'm saying we might want to make use of some of these one-time funds. I think the degree to which we will need to use them will be less than last year, but still something that we're going to have to do. So I remain more optimistic and feel like we'll be on a firmer footing, but I don't want anyone to think that we'll be fully back to the point where we will be using ongoing funds for every one of our ongoing functions. There still will be some need, much less than that 13 million I mentioned in the other part of the budget and the 4 million I mentioned here. Less, but still, nevertheless, still a piece of what we have.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, Mr. Schwartz. I feel like that was sort of listening to Greenspan every word right there as you were saying it, but I appreciate that. Go ahead, Ms. Crystal.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. And just wanted to add my voice to where Mr. Dorsey was going. Last year was so challenging because we did have, between what was then the CARES Act, right, the first round of federal relief, and then just one-time sources, for example, the savings on the leasing of this building. We were simultaneously having a very difficult conversation about the constraints of ongoing funding, while also being in an environment with a fair bit of one-time funding. That is the type of environment that makes it very tempting to engage in behaviors that are not responsible. And I think we saw that happen, for example, all across the Commonwealth when the General Assembly and Governor, in their wisdom, said that there would be teacher salaries to be raised if only the localities would match them at a time that the localities were experiencing significant shortfalls in ongoing revenue, but awash in one time. And so I think this is going to be a challenging budget conversation for us to have, and I think it behooves all of us to try to really be as responsible as we can in those conversations. And I really appreciate Mr. Dorsey asking that straight out of the gate, because I think this is going to be a big theme ahead. I just wanted to, I know you're not necessarily asking for feedback on the ARPA proposals or suggestions you've outlaid, but I just wanted to share kind of a couple of my own values, or to the extent I see sort of a through line of these opportunities. I think there is a story to be told on a number of issues in which the pandemic focused our attention and in some cases significantly exacerbated longstanding problems, not only in the Arlington community, but our society. What is exciting to me about the potential of the ARPA dollars is that I think Arlington has the building blocks to tackle some of those problems in a really meaningful way. And I hope that we can use these funds, frankly, as jet fuel to do it. Mental health is one of those areas where I know our team at DHS has been working tirelessly to sort of come up with with these sort of investments that could make meaningful change and progress for community members experiencing behavioral health challenges that have only gotten more severe during the pandemic. Childcare is another one. You know, I was just saying to somebody earlier today, it feels like the rest of the country has caught up to where Arlington was back in 2018, was acknowledging that we had this really severe challenge. You know, I think we have weathered better than a lot of communities. The closures, for example, of daycare centers, we've seen fewer, but we know from our risk and reach analyses about like some very specific places we can make investments. You know, I think it is within striking distance to meet the kind of remaining delta of low-income kids and families that need reliable childcare. I think the ARPA funding is an opportunity to take a big bet on things like non-traditional hours of childcare, which we knew is a huge need in our community. And the last point, too, that I'll make as well is transit. You know, we have done regionally through the Northern Virginia Transportation Commission some really, I think, thoughtful analyses about the opportunities for zero fare transit and the need to approach that with some finesse, right? That especially in a system where so much of our fares on ART are actually paid by the federal government via smart benefits, right? Entirely zero fare may not make sense, but there are so many opportunities for us to figure out exactly as you've teed up for us, zero fare for the transit dependent, zero fare for students. You know, we have seen a huge blow to public transit, and when it comes to the effects of the pandemic and the opportunity to build on what we know and entice folks back and using ARPA dollars to do that. So I am now at risk of kind of belaboring the theme, but the phrase, it's so hackneyed, that comes to mind is a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. And I just think about how we have a once in a generation infusion of one-time funding. We have the needs that have grown during the pandemic, but we also have the policy analysis, the staff work, and the political will to tackle these in big ways. So there's not a lot to be excited about with regard to the consequences of the pandemic, but I think this is one, and I'm excited to see what specific ideas staff can bring forward and we can weigh in on in the month ahead.
Thank you, Ms. Crystal. Ms. Garvey.
Yeah, thank you. I think I'll pick up where both my colleagues were. I also think this is a once in a generation opportunity, and it is important to do some of these things. I think that's where we all want to go. However, I found myself thinking, I think along the lines of Mr. Dorsey, watching the presentation. So we have $46 million, which we're going to get half in 21 and half in 22, and then we have to have it all spent by the end of 26. Is that right? So I'm just wondering, and sorry, this is like just came to me while sometimes things get revealed by presentations. Might we want, maybe not this year, but the next year, so I think we don't want all that money to get spent and like then we fall off a cliff, because it feels like what we're trying to do is provide the support so as hopefully our vacancy rate goes down and we do better and better, you know, we kind of have a nice kind of down a glide. So possibly not this year, but possibly the next budget year, have you thought of sort of being explicit about the fact that not all this money is going to get spent in these 2 budget years, but we may want to be parsing it out, spreading it out so that we can come to more of a glide path down, and hopefully we'll be up and running by the time the money gives out.
So I think that is what you're saying is music to my fiscally conservative heart. But the one of the slides we had there, which and I apologize, I know that Mr. Dorsey may come over and clobber me. The bridge that we had in one of those slides, that what we really need to do is we need to get to the other side, and we need to make sure we have the funds to get to the other side. So allocating all the money is not necessarily a virtue in this process in the first year or year and a half. And that's one of the good things about the rescue plan is the money doesn't have to be obligated right away. So the concept of keeping 10 or 20% of it available for an as-needed basis and seeing how we're doing might make a lot of sense. And so that's something the board can weigh as we look at the proposals coming forward next month.
Thank you. And I think it'll really come home next year. But this puts us at a hard point. I was thinking in some ways we can kind of relax a little bit because we've got this support. But then, Ms. Crystal, you brought up the issue of childcare. We don't want to get that off to a roaring start and then 2 years later have the bottom drop out.
And that's why these have to be capital investments, one-time investments. I mean, this is exactly Mr. Dorsey's point that I was trying to emphasize. We cannot make ongoing investments on the basis of one-time money. Yeah. Exactly.
Although It is the salaries that are the issue, but that's another difficult question. Yeah.
Licensing, capital bills.
Yeah.
There are a lot of.
Yeah, no, that's right, because then the costs go down. Yes, excuse me, I'm getting in the weeds here at the dais. Apologies, we can talk about this.
No
Okay.
problem. As long as they're not legislating on the dais, I'm less worried about the weeds, but want to be mindful of our staff. Mr. Karantonis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Schwartz. I fully agree with Ms. Crystal and Mr. Dorsey and Ms. Garvey on this. Yes, it's an amazing opportunity to do things that we otherwise would have to postpone or ration in a way that would be very difficult to lift. And we can do that. On the other side, we do have two basic pressures. One is the general operation of the government begins to be more expensive, and we started. Mr. Schwartz, you started already talking about the pressure of competitive wages and retention funding. This is concerning to me because I know that this adds to the base of our operation budget. So this is not like we are cruising. The second thing is one thing that I believe Ms. Crystal forgot is housing. So, for example, we know that our pressure on housing grants funds, for example, will be higher. And last year already, we tried to find ways to, on the one side, we had the eviction prevention and rental assistance funding that is 100% COVID related. I do think that during the recovery, we will be moving from this into building structures that are more longer term, medium and longer term. And this is, to me, the first thing that comes to mind is the housing grants program and how we improve that, and how we make it more effective, and how we reach more people. Because right now, we're basically paying 94% of the recipients are people who live already in affordable housing, in committed affordable housing. So we want to expand that. We want to expand this space. And I'm very interested in to see how over several years, so until 2026, as Ms. Garvey said, how we can help with this money to make this kind of strategic adjustment of our housing support programs. Other than that, I'm very interested to know, to see how we adjust with the increased cost of operation, and how far this increased cost of operation. I mean, as we've seen before in the tax revenue. The tax revenue projection, it doesn't look like right now that our tax revenue will be increasing at the same pace. It will be lagging. So that's a point of concern for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Karantonis. I'm mindful that for me, the child care capital costs are of interest. And I also, as I've shared with colleagues, addressing those most in need, which often is through personnel to serve those most in need. DHS, there's needs there on mental health as well. But I'll also be trying to think about one of our other deficits, which seems to be the challenge we face with respect to the 30,000 Arlingtonians who have household income less than $35,000 a year. And so I'm interested in the ARPA piece, in addition to employee compensation, seeing if we can make strategic investments there while mindful of being fiscally responsible. So I want to just, Mr. Schwartz, I saw your light on. Did you go ahead?
The only thing I wanted to add, and it just highlighted in all of your comments, which is that there's a delicate balance going on here, but making sure that we realize the ARPA funds are one time. We also see an improvement in our ongoing revenue, but we're not back to where we were in 2019. I remain optimistic that we'll be able to do those things that the board states are priorities. We will not be able to do everything. We'll have to make some choices. And I'll talk a little bit later about the personnel issues. One-time use of these kinds of dollars for personnel can be effective, but not for base salaries. It can be effective for other types of things. So I actually, am optimistic that we have the team right behind me and the people in front of me, and we have a community. We'll get to actually a good place. And I think people can't lose sight. The rescue plan is actually a good thing. I mean, and it's about $2 trillion. Some people have asked why we didn't get more. We've gotten, I think, our fair share, and it will help us, and we have some choices to make, but I think we'll be better for it.
Thank you, Mr. Schwartz. Really appreciate those conceptually closing comments. Just a little housekeeping. Am I right that Ms. Hughes' presentation as well as your presentation will go up on our budget website? And there continues to be an email for feedback and thoughts on that website with respect to budget comments. So then I'll just quickly ask for transparency for our community and with the forgiveness of a few staff in the audience, just a second. Ms. Jacobs, we worked on a set of draft guidance. This is for fiscal year 23, and I want to clarify, we've been focused on the ARPA discussion. This is for fiscal year 23, and this is mostly not so that people can try to read really quickly every word, but it is meant to show our community that the board has worked on draft guidance that we will finalize over the coming month and adopt next month that reflects a lot of the priorities that were discussed, but this is for ongoing budget needs. And this is a draft. We will also post this on our budget website over the coming couple of days. There's just a little bit more for illustrative purposes on the second page, if you don't mind, Madam Clerk, Ms. Jacobs. So, there are a couple we did not talk in detail about climate change challenges, and we have to address that. That will be part of our budget guidance, as it is a shared priority of all members of the board. So with that, we'll conclude, and I'm mindful that there are other presentations and we'll send it back to Mr. Schwartz, maybe on the census. I know there's 3 other topics in your report. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to ask if we can, if Chief Penn and Anita Friedman go up to the microphone there, and Deborah will sit behind. And I'm going to ask, given the hour, I do want to ask the indulgence of the board, because it's unusual for me as I go through in preparation for a board meeting to feel like I need to come to you and talk about something that is I don't want to overstate it. I don't want to call it a crisis, but it's of high importance to me, and I feel like I want to discuss it with you and with the community. So about 2 weeks ago, I had asked Chief Penn to prepare a presentation that would talk a little bit about crime statistics and the reports in the community. With more people up and about as the pandemic seemed to be loosening its grip. That was going to be the purpose of the conversation. But related and important issues come up over the past 2 weeks, so that's the reason why I've asked Chief Penn and our staff from DHS to be here today and to answer your questions. Last week, a story was published in local media that highlighted some of the retention issues facing the Arlington County Police Department. And as Chief Penn reported to me on Friday, to date this calendar year, 46 officers have either announced their intent to leave the force, have left, or retired. 46. This compares with a total of 26 for all of calendar 20, and more officers have left the force to date this year than left in all of calendar year 2019 and 2020 combined. We're also aware that there are additional members of the force who are in the application process and may leave between now and the end of the year. Now, some of you will remember back to 2018 when then Chief Farr restructured the duties of the department, and that assumed a functional strength of 325 officers. Today, we're at 290. And we're going to be closer to 280 by the time we get to November. And some additional data. From March 1st through September 2nd of this year, we have used 3,330 hours of overtime to meet minimum staffing. The same figure for this time last year was 1,680 hours. So the number of overtime hours we've used have doubled just between March and September of this year. Also, 35% of our current supervisors in the police department have come into their positions in the last 12 months. Since June of this year, police have lost 26 staff, 9 of whom were supervisors. And the chief can talk a little bit about it. He is not intending to fill those supervisory positions, just given some of the issues I laid out. There are two other important trends to highlight. The departure of police officers in Arlington, it's not unique to Arlington. So there's some trends here that, we like to think we can control our destiny, but other things that are going on the national level. The job of police officers has become more complicated, and whatever your view on what's going on nationally, we're really proud, and this board talked about it in July and many times, about our professional police department and how we're a model agency. But our police officers have made it clear that the demands and stress are really weighing heavily on them. And part of that article that came out last week, a survey of current police staff showed that close to 100 are thinking of leaving within the next 12 months. Some recently who have left the profession. While for the first time in memory, some choose to leave the police department to join the fire department. And others have simply retired early. And then some have taken advantage of something. I know I talked to the board about this in 2018 and 2019 when Amazon was coming. I said, thank God Amazon is coming. I said, I may be back in 3 or 4 years saying, oh my God, Amazon's here. We have lost a number of staff, including Deputy Chief Quigley will be leaving next week. Just as recently in the past week, 3 or 4 officers who are going to Amazon as they staff up their operation, which I have to say makes sense. They're going to a lower stress environment for higher pay, and I understand that. Another trend, and this one is really very recent, and I would characterize it as especially cruel. Our police participated actively, and we worked closely with the police practices group this past year. Our officers, our chief, this board was incredibly excited about how we have an opportunity to have much more of our mental health care treatment handled by clinical professionals. And the board appropriated funds for that to stand up crisis teams. And police and DHS have been working literally day and night to make that board's commitment and the community's wish and the desire of police and DHS a reality. However, since July 9th, when the Commonwealth of Virginia shut down admissions to nearly all state psychiatric hospitals, Arlington County Police have been called, as they always have, to a number of serious and urgent situations where people require immediate attention for their mental health needs. In these circumstances, when a temporary detention order is required and no mental health beds are available in Arlington or anywhere else in the state, the individuals going through the trauma and stress of serious mental health crisis are essentially being warehoused at Virginia Hospital Center. As the hours stretch on, the individuals are sometimes sedated and handcuffed to gurneys. I'll discuss the needs of our mental health professionals in a minute, but on many shifts, our police, over the past weeks, 3, 4, and sometimes more officers must sit with these individuals in the emergency room. Sometimes half of our shift strength of officers are essentially out of service, sitting in the emergency room at Virginia Hospital Center. The work of our officers, which is often rewarding and was envisioned just recently when I talked about creating the Community Engagement Division with Deputy Chief Vincent, and the work of our officers to enhance traffic safety and to work with businesses and restaurants, is being left untended if those trends continue. Our police, I want to make it clear to the community, our police will always be there to respond to violent crimes in our community. However, the work that makes the job of a police officer fulfilling, some of those things I just mentioned, the chance to make a difference by being part of the solution rather than just showing up to pick the pieces of shattered lives, picking those up, that soon could be missing if these trends continue. And I can't fulfill my charge as county manager to keep this community safe with a great police department without a fighting chance. So I'm going to have some proposals I'll discuss about that in a minute. However, before I do that, I wanted to talk about the other part of what I raised today. The staff that handle our mental health crises, our emergency staff in DHS, is at this moment itself down more than 50% in staffing, including supervisors. The action by the Commonwealth to shutter their hospitals to new admissions has again thrust our overtaxed and understaffed emergency service clinicians into the middle of an impossible situation. A group that was staffed at 26 individuals now has less than half that strength, half of the 26. The team can't cover all shifts. They are called nonstop to respond to the same calls I just referenced earlier. The job of being a behavioral health emergency service worker has, like police, become more complex with increased acuity seen in the persons served, with elevated expectations and a high public profile. This work requires significant clinical training and certification as a pre-screener. It is a mandated service critical to public safety. The Client Services Bureau, in which emergency services is embedded, is currently at a 32% vacancy rate. That's 13 out of the 41 staff, with 2 more about to go out on maternity leave. This is a trend we've seen over the last 3 years. Key positions such as emergency clinicians and psychiatrists are extremely hard to fill as the result of a national shortage, public demand, escalating needs, compensation, complexity of the work, 24-hour demand, and competition with surrounding jurisdictions. When there are not enough staff available, other DH staff who are dedicated to addiction treatment or other acute issues are required to fill in, and the department's ability to carry out its most important and most immediate mission is impaired. And like police, there is a turnover in behavioral health, over 30% over the past 3 years, and a local, regional, and national shortage of persons with the credentials needed to perform these duties. So over the past several weeks, our police, Department of Human Services, and I want to thank our Sheriff's Department and the representatives of the Virginia Hospital Center have been meeting literally every day to accelerate planned improvements so that we can take the Crisis Intervention Center at the Department of Human Services and use it as an alternative to the emergency department when patients in a behavioral health crisis must board until their service they desperately need becomes available. A number of steps have been taken, but a critical need right now is for therapeutic staff to provide 24/7, 365 coverage in the Crisis Intervention Center to ensure the needs of persons in crises are met and they are in a safe and calm environment. That need is currently not budgeted. So as I said at the Saturday board meeting, and as I noted earlier today in discussing the budget outlook and also in guidance, businesses and government are finding recruitment and retention of staff particularly difficult during the pandemic. We have challenges in our libraries. Our businesses have challenges in hiring restaurant workers and grocery staff. And when hiring and retention challenges affect the community's health and safety, that is the most important challenge I have as county manager. And so I want to be clear to everybody, the time will come soon, not today, but soon to address the challenges about filling our staff at libraries and parks, our staff in planning and technology, and many of our other departments. But I'm saying today the challenges we face for health and safety positions can't wait. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to suggest today an idea, and I will then consult with labor representatives. I'm going to ask the board if they would not take a formal action, but I'll call it a soft set-aside of $3 million of that $12 million I just talked about to set aside for potential retention and incentive bonuses, one-time payments to the workforce I've just talked about. To emphasize, I don't have a specific proposal for you today. This is really complicated to figure out how we want to structure it, and we're working with human resources about the best way to do it. But it's critical, I feel, to signal to the staff involved, please don't leave. We need you. We need those payments. And again, these are just one of the steps that we'll be able to take. So I know I'm speaking in somewhat dire tones. I feel like the situation is really critical, and I will stop there. And I know you'll have a number of questions. I hope your questions really will be for the chief and for our staff at the Department of Human Services. And I'm also happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Schwartz. You've outlined some stark concerns, and we'll take questions. Ms. Crystal.
Thank you very much. I think that was a very excellent and compelling summation of a set of issues that I think we've sort of seen swirling for a while. And I think to some extent the closure of the state hospitals might have been a precipitating event for something that has been a challenge that has been slow moving and yet very severe. I guess the question I have, and this probably is for our professionals, and our manager alluded to it, but I think about how, certainly we've seen this on the side of education and teachers, and I suspect it's true for policing and mental health work as well. For a while, we have been in Arlington maybe able to kind of outrun some national dynamics, right, of not enough people going into these fields. We've been able to compensate, I'm not going to say well, right, like we've heard very loud and clear from our employee groups, at least on the public safety side. And so I'm certainly not going to say, very well objectively, but very well relatively. And so to the extent that there were still folks in this field to recruit, Arlington could make a good play for them. And now with the pandemic, and I think the shortages of people willing to enter these professions or stay in these professions for the very good reasons you've described, there's almost no outrunning to be done. This has come for all of us, which I suppose is a roundabout way of saying, is this something that can be solved with recruitment and retention bonuses? I know you've talked about these structural issues. I know that especially on the mental health side, our team is working, as you were saying, to change the crisis intervention center as a sort of an alternative to what's happening with emergency response that requires the sustained police piece. I know we're trying to be innovative at a time when staff are short supplied, but I guess the question is how far does this get us? Not that it's not an excellent idea, and I'm happy to give that soft support that you've asked, but are there more structural pieces about the job of policing right now, or the job of being a mental health provider right now, that we can't outrun anymore and need, whether it's through lobbying at the state level, further policy reforms on the public safety side that we need to be embracing as aggressively as we are the idea of recruitment and retention bonuses? I know that's a really big question to put to you both, but I just want to make sure we're not, I think this is an almost essential strategy, but is it enough?
I think there's a lot that goes to it. I want to begin by talking about, I'm incredibly fortunate to have very talented and professional staff. I mean, I think it's important to acknowledge that and the great work that's done daily. I'm incredibly proud of the police department and the men and women that work there. And, I think we've continued to provide service at an above average or an exceptional level. And part of the conversation really needs to be the setting of expectations and what can we realistically do. I mean, to be perfectly honest, we cannot continue service level at where we are today with the numbers that we're at. It's just not possible. So I think there's a lot of conversation and prioritizing and what can we do with what we have? But, it is critical to start with retaining the exceptional staff that we do have. And I've been having conversations across the department about we're going to have to take a look at the next 6 months. I mean, my goal is to get to November when our current recruit class finish field training and get out on the road. But that's not going to fix the issue that we're in. So how can we restructure, make changes, different ways of approaching things to address, officer burnout, having a work-life balance, and where are we going to prioritize our work? I mean, there was a lot of conversation, which, we certainly supported, where law enforcement should do less with mental health. Well, I think we're doing more mental health now than we have in some time. And, the need is to help people get the care and treatment that they need. But, it is a big, broad conversation that goes beyond the police department. But I think this is a good first step, and then really taking a look at what can we do moving forward, what structural changes do we need to make, long-term or at least for the interim to create a balance.
Yeah.
Thank you, Chief Penn. Did you want to?
And I don't know if our Human Services team has anything to add.
Thank you, County Board members and Mr. Manager, and I'm here with Deborah Warren, who's the Executive Director of our Community Services Board. I think the simple answer to your question, Ms. Crystal, is we cannot afford not to take action. Emergency services is a mandated service. Not just that, I have always viewed most of our clinicians, but especially emergency services clinicians, as non-uniform public safety. Yeah. They don't wear the badge, they don't have a gun, but they are in as much danger oftentimes as public safety without really the same level of benefits. That said, without a strong emergency services staff, competent, equipped to deal with people, you will see increase in suicide, homicide, and all other kinds of community problems, because these are the people who receive the calls and talk the person from jumping off the bridge. So it is key that we be able to retain these people, and we simply cannot function at 60% of 100% staffing. Plus, we have come under increasing pressure, and you know, we very much engage with the advocates in conversations throughout the years. You know, Director Warren has been in conversations with NAMI and our Arlington Mental Health Associates, but we cannot do everything at the same time.
Yeah.
And although certain things are important, of course, first episode psychosis, there has to be, like Chief Penn is saying, a prioritization. Mm-hmm. A prioritization. It's the same people. We are the same people who are doing eviction prevention, coronavirus, mental health. There are so many community problems that are at our hands, but these folks, emergency clinicians, can go to other places, and they're going because they're getting better salaries, and their workload is, you know, sometimes less than what we are requiring. I don't know if you wanted to add, Ms. Warren.
Yes. Well, there are. Okay, well, there are a lot of options for people who are credentialed, licensed clinicians, including, you know, telehealth was a great opportunity, but now there's all kinds of private entities that are recruiting. You know, I get these lovely cards in the mail all the time. You know, come work for us, you'll get a signing bonus, less paperwork. So a couple of points. I think in terms of sort of state level, I think working on with lobbying for less regulation, licensing standards, less standards around Medicaid and so forth. I think we also need, it's just very hard to do the work, the amount of paperwork. It's unbelievable. But also, I think there's a longer-term piece that you're addressing, which is we have pipeline issues. Mm-hmm. People don't want to go into this work. It's not lucrative relative to, you know, and it involves, and we share so many pieces of this puzzle. It involves face-to-face work with people who are truly in a crisis and maybe behaving in a way that's scary or, you know, be threatening. And people can do other things. There's so many jobs available right now. So I think we really do need to develop more of a training academy approach in terms of behavioral health, more of create lower level positions so that people have a career ladder to build up, to get the training and experience, to get that license and to become pre-screeners. There's just a lot of pieces to the puzzle.
Yeah. I really appreciate that, and I think certainly stopping the bleeding, right, is part of it, and the hemorrhaging of staff, because it's clear, right, that creates the cycle. You're more likely to have to work overtime when they're under strength. You're more likely to have to handle the hardest cases when you can't share a spectrum of them. I don't want to overstate the applicability of this example because it's so much smaller in scale, but the example does come to mind of how having in community, or more or less in community, resources for sexual assault nurse exams reminds me a little bit of this situation, because we had officers, right, who would have to accompany a victim of sexual assault or domestic violence to Woodbridge or Petersburg, right, and would chew up the entirety of their shift. Being able to bring those services into the community was really helpful for not only the survivors, but also less time for officers. And so, you know, I don't think there's a magic bullet here on the mental health emergency side, and I think in part because it's so large in scale. But I do, you know, to the extent we've got upstream options, it's a yes and strategy, I guess. But I really appreciate, I think one of my takeaways listening to both sides of this very interrelated phenomenon is the setting of expectations is really important. And at a time when we're in such crisis, you know, a community that has always prided itself on innovation and new approaches, it may not be the time that we get our arms around that until we can address the crisis. So I'm sorry I've taken enough time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Ms. Crystal. Chief Penn, did you? I see your light on. You may have wanted to add at this stage.
No, I was just going to follow up on one point. I mean, you know, I think the expectation piece is important, and, you know, the signaling to staff how much their work matters, and the work-life balance and the job satisfaction is key. I mean, you know, I think we've continued to provide service at a level, you know, and I've had this roll call at 5:30 this morning where we're trying to keep providing at the level we have been and watching our numbers go down. So, you know, I think there's many pieces to the overall approach here.
Thank you, Chief Penn. Ms. Garvey.
Yeah, thank you. And I'll just say I want to thank the manager for, this was not easy to listen to. And I think in all my years, and it's been a lot, this is something that's kind of got my stomach clutching more than most things that come before us. But thank you, because we need to hear it, and the community needs to hear it. So I appreciate it. And I think in listening to Ms. Crystal's line of questioning and sort of and some of the responses, it seems pretty clear. The manager's coming to us with the emergency thumb in the dike thing that we need to do now. I'm totally supportive. And then what we need to do is make sure that we start rebuilding the dike, and that's going to be longer term. So that probably there's a medium term, I'm sure, before getting to the longer term. And then the communications piece is huge, and that's difficult. It's good that Ms. Helfer is here, our communications person par excellence, because it's both communicating expectations to our community, what we're going to be able to do, what the situation really is, which is going to be something new for them. This is not something Arlington is used to hearing. And then communications, obviously, to our employees, that we do value them, care for them, and we're going to try and do everything we can to make these jobs something that they want to continue in and attract folks. Hopefully we can maybe even reach out to, and then I think for us, there's going to be work on the government level with the state and the federal, if we can work on those regulations. You know, during COVID, it was emergency situation. You hear about emergency standards of care, right, in Idaho. Maybe for mental health at some point, maybe we've got to ask and get some kind of emergency standard of care right now so that we can do this and not have to do quite all that paperwork and get that down to reasonable levels. And that's maybe something we can help with both our legislators on both the state and the federal level. And I think we're willing to work on that. But it feels like this needs to be a full court press, a really full court press, and I'm all in. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Garvey, Mr. Dorsey, and then Mr. Karantonis.
Yeah, thank you. This is all incredibly sobering, but as colleagues you have acknowledged, not altogether unexpected given circumstances. But, you know, at the core, aside from the very real circumstances that you're describing among officers and the mental health clinicians, what we have here, Mr. Karantonis can join me in, and this is a good old-fashioned labor shortage. And you really don't have a whole bunch of tools to deal with those. Those are fairly straightforward. You provide incentives for people to stay and or incentives for people to join up. And as we think about that, areas on the join up part have sometimes not been as successful because there's a relaxation of standards, as there's been an approach of wanting to bring in a warm body. And retention efforts haven't been as successful as they could otherwise been because there's been an attempt to make it available to everybody so as to be broad and fair. So what I'm not necessarily looking for an answer now, but would just express as my individual expectation is that we figure out some way to make sure that we are retaining excellence and that we are encouraging excellence through whatever incentives that we think about, and that the relaxation of standards is done only when we believe that those standards are outdated, outmoded, and unnecessary, and are not simply in pursuit of warm bodies, because that may ease the short-term pain, but it creates long-term pain in terms of the delivery of those services in the community. So certainly you're welcome to. I don't need you to respond now. I just want to articulate it. And I know it's sometimes difficult when you've got your thumb on the dike. You don't necessarily always make long-term decisions. I'm just hoping that here we do so.
Go ahead, Chief Penn.
So, yeah, I'd like to comment on that. I mean, the one thing that I want to be real clear about is that we have not changed our hiring standards. The only change that we've made in my time in this role is, how long it has to be since somebody used marijuana. Instead of 2 years, it's 1 year. That's it. I mean, and I honestly have no intention of changing that because, I am incredibly proud of the men and women that work in the police department and the work that they do. And it's important to me to continue to provide service at the exceptional level. It's just a matter of finding the balance to where we do as much as we can. But it's important to start with the right folks in the job.
Thank you, Chief Penn. Ms. Friedman.
Likewise, we have not relaxed any of our hiring standards, and I think you know that each of our programs has a data-driven performance measurement plan, which is now disaggregated by racial and ethnic data. But those performance measurement plans also are tied to individual key work expectations. So, we have a regular means of assessing how well people are individually performing towards the program goals. So.
Ms. Warren, anything to add, or that covers it?
I would just add that we have very crisp and clear documentation standards, tons of clinical supervisory oversight and productivity standards. So we have all kinds of measurements of quality, and we ensure that we maintain that level of quality.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Chair?
You want to pick up on that?
I
Go
do,
ahead.
because I want to thank Mr. Dorsey for, when I was talking about crisis standards of care, I was talking about the paperwork that you just say is just impossible and not worthwhile, and that was my focus, not on the quality. So thank you, Mr. Dorsey, for making that clear. We do want to continue with quality people. The one point I meant to also say is I think we could be long-term talking to our local universities and the community college, because I think there's a lot of recruiting to be done there that we could do, and a lot of folks that might be interested in these fields. So calling us to make some of those outreach efforts too, if that would be helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Carver. You good, Mr. Dorsey? So, Mr. Karantonis, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The discussion that we are having is also indicating that maybe we should have also our HR, specialists here who could, explain, for example. To be honest with you, one of the scary things for me, being a relative newbie in this, is that in 6 months you lost 50% of your workforce. Because if I understand it correctly, from March 1st to September 2nd, 13 people less, right? More or less? Or did I understand it wrong? So how fast did we lose, in the Crisis Intervention Center, how fast did we lose 50% of our people?
Oh, and emergency services?
Yes.
Oh, yes. In a year.
In a year?
In a year, yeah, in the last year.
Yeah. We have been averaging a 30% turnover rate for the last 3 years.
Yes.
In behavioral health.
So this is...
On average, a third of the workforce turns over.
Mm-hmm. So this is a very volatile and taxing.
Yes.
So we were basically operating at the limit of, the staffing
Well, we've always had,
elasticity of this,
very
right?
high caseloads for outpatient, and then struggling, as Deborah mentioned, to staff the emergency services 24/7. So we've had to use contractors at times when we don't have full staff.
So I guess you understand where I'm going. I mean, to understand the real pressures that we have been basically tolerating for a very, very long time, and now we have all of a sudden an overdrive and overheating of the problem.
Well,
and
that I think was
lose
precipitated by the closure of the, as you
Of the
remember,
hospitals, yeah.
the state hospitals, because Craig Deeds, incident proposed that the state hospitals be allowed to be the hospital of last resort. The current commissioner, who comes from the private sector, is looking at the interests of the hospitals above the interest of the locality, basically.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt you.
No, I understand. This is a dynamic that we need to understand because it really affects how we, have to plan for response to that. Because, just stemming the bleeding right now, it doesn't hire you the 13 people that you would need, right? It just keeps, the 13 people who are now there. And the same applies to the police force, I guess. Only in the police force, I understand that we have a pipeline, right? We have a police academy, and we have also people who are officers who are right now in training, but they are still don't count against. I mean, they're not counted in the force because they are in training. Is that correct?
Sure. We have, an overall hired strength of 342 or 3 today, but, we have 24 people in field training, 20 or so people in the academy, and then we've already started hiring for the January academy. So when officers are in this training phase, they don't count as a functional officer. And, years ago, those class sizes were 8, 10, 12, and now we're at 23, 24 because we've seen higher numbers of people leaving, and we're having higher numbers of people in one of the 3 different training statuses that we have. So, right now we have 45 or so people in a training status because we've had higher turnover, certainly this year, and in years before it's been elevated.
So, Chief, what does it say to us looking at these, soon-to-be officers, based on the scenario that the county manager explained, that we are looking to a force of 280, 60 or more down from where it should be. So what should we do to retain already them, like kind of preventively, to make sure that they come into the force and they stay?
I think it's a multi-step conversation. I think, monetary is showing the appreciation for their work. I think there's things inside that it's important to me to have a scenario where, it's a reasonable work-life balance. We're not over-demanding. Have different career paths. That's really big for new officers. Have opportunities to do different things. And as my numbers shrink, my ability to let people go be a detective or do plain clothes or be promoted to supervisor, that goes away too. So it's a self-eating problem. As the numbers go down, the ability to do different things goes down. But I still think it's important, and we are working on creating career pathing for non-supervisors. How do we manage expectations with the community on what we can do and what we can't do, and maybe roll back some of the things we take reports for. The goal being that we continue to provide the core services and provide them at a very exceptional level, but where can we find space to balance the workload, balance the ability for officers like the manager was talking about to make a difference in the community, to really enjoy coming to work and not go call to call to call or spend 8 hours sitting with somebody. So I think there's a lot of pieces to this puzzle, and I think this is the first part, and we've begun having conversations in the department about career pathing and what are we going to do for the next couple of months and what are we going to do for the winter, spring.
Thank you. Of course, I'm supportive of the proposal right now. The only thing is that I am also mindful that we need to find the other pieces of the solution, or align the other pieces of the solution that gets us to hire the appropriate staff sooner rather than later. And I don't know how soon this should be. I believe that in the case of the of our mental health response, it's
Sure.
yesterday. So we don't have any time there. I think this is a really critical problem. I mean, I'm not saying, Chief, that police department is not critical. I'm just saying that I am kind of appalled when 50% of the appropriate, response force is not present. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Carantonis. 46 is the number you said to Chief Penn. Mr. Dorsey.
Thank you. So, Chief Penn, I'm reading a book now by Rosa Brooks, an academic who spent some time with the Metropolitan Police Department as one of their volunteer sworn officers. And with all apologies, I haven't read any studies of that program to know whether it's been deemed effective or if you have an opinion of it. But at least from her first person account, it seems like a program such as that, which for the benefit of everyone else, they actually put people through the same training that they do sworn officers and ultimately treat them as sworn officers with the primary difference that they don't pay them a dime. And so I was wondering if that was something that you had looked into either as a replica model or something that you could copy as a hybrid to solve not all of your issues, but some of the issues in terms of overtaxing individual officers, keeping them in one duty area, having to have them do things that are not their calling for policing as part of their regular routine. It seems like maybe having other folks who could do that while still upholding a level of training and excellence could help. Won't help tomorrow, but long term.
No, we do have an auxiliary program of auxiliary officers, and I think that's one of the things, we use auxiliaries, we use interns. We're one of the very few police departments that have interns following up on some of the criminal investigations, the lower level things. I mean, I think we are looking for every way we can to balance the workload, provide the service at the highest level we can, but have a balance to where, we have the opportunity to make the difference in the community, to be engaged in things and not call to call to call. So I've not read that book, but I am interested in it. I think we've tried to step outside the box, do different things. Somebody had mentioned colleges. We actually partner with about 25 colleges and send our staff back who are alumni, send them back there. And, not just when people are graduating, but for 2 or 3 years to build the relationship, to try to draw people to Arlington, because the seemingly truth is the number of people interested in a career in law enforcement right now, today, is much smaller pool than it used to be. So we have to be much more aggressive to go find the people that meet the standards that we want in Arlington and actively recruit, court, whatever.
Well, I'm almost finished, so I'll drop it by when I'm done. It's called Tangled Up in Blue. Interesting, and maybe talk to your police colleagues from the district about their program, because it's her first person account, but I find it fascinating. So,
Tangled Up in Blue?
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Dorsey and Chief Penn. So the question, I guess, for Mr. Schwartz, is coach us through. You're asking for three.
So, right. Yeah. So what I normally would do is I'd say, make a motion, vote to allocate $3 million to be spent in the following way. The problem is I haven't got the following way figured out exactly yet. So hearing from you that you're all supportive of generally, I may not need the full amount, but I will come back to you with a refined, fully fleshed out proposal. I know that Anita and Deborah and Andy have been, I think you had a couple of meetings today before you came here, just on this. I'll be back to you with some very specifics. The point is, I just wanted to signal to the workforce and the people involved in this that we have your support. The final contours of the plan are no small feat, and we will come back to you maybe even before the next board meeting and ask you to bless a specific plan. But I just wanted to know that at least I had your support for the concept and the allocation generally before you even, I'm not asking you to vote on anything specific right now.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Mr. Chair, I move that we nod our heads. Sure.
Exactly. I was trying to figure out whether it's not, you raised it, so it's not direction to the manager, it's ratifying the direction you're already headed. As far as communications, I suspect there'll be a few officers and a few mental health leaders who are paying attention to this moment And so I'll ask just that you also coach us if there's anything communications-wise that this board needs to do in addition. We're fully with you, Mr. Schwartz, Chief Penn, on moving forward with this, and also Ms. Friedman and Ms. Warren. I really think you summed it up with a powerful sentence. Ms. Friedman, if we don't do this, we can't afford not to do this. So thank you, Mr. Schwartz, for bringing it forward. We'll want to understand the fiscal details and be responsible, but first, let's move forward and address this. There's a through line between our police department and our mental health services, and that's, with respect to staffing, that's what we have to move quickly, and the board is ready to do that with you, Mr. Schwartz.
I thank the board. I know that we sometimes lose sight of this. This problem is happening everywhere right now in Virginia, everywhere. And I feel we have more of the tools and certainly the will here to do what we can to try to stave what have really has been a tide that's been lapping at the dike, to use that. So I want to thank everybody.
Thank you, Mr. Schwartz, and thank you, Chief Penn, Ms. Friedman, and Ms. Warren, and most importantly, all the folks who are working with and for you that are trying to help us.
Mr. Chair, what I want to do now is harken back when Mr. Dorsey was chair in 2019. The extent of our existential dilemmas and angst was over the fight of our lifetime, which was to have a complete census. And it was, and it still is. And Elizabeth Hardy is here, and Emily Garrett, who's been working for the county for about 2 years, but you may never have met, is also here with Elizabeth, works in the same unit. They're here to give you an update on the initial results from the 2020 census. And as you know, we had a complete count committee, and they worked tirelessly. And, we had an enumeration rate of 99.98%. And I think I'm going to be dinging both Elizabeth and Emily on their performance appraisal for missing that final 0.02%. But I'm going to turn it over to Elizabeth and Emily for a presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Schwartz. Before you get started, you've been patient, and as far as the order of this, and just a thank you for bearing with us. You may have other things after 6:30 that you wanted most to be doing, so go ahead. Thank you.
Great. Thank you for having us here tonight. We are excited because this is a once every 10 years thing that we get. We get census data. So we're here tonight to talk about redistricting data that has been released. If I can get this to go. Okay. So in August, the Census Bureau started to release 2020 census data that started with the PL file, that's Public Law File 94-171, and that is a file that's mandated for the Census Bureau to release data for the redistricting purposes to small level geographies. And included in that file is total population, population by race, population by age, 18 years and over, group quarters population, housing units, and housing vacancy. The Census Bureau is mandated to release that 1 year after Census Day, which, as you may recall, is April 1st. So it was April 1st, 2020. A little delayed for a couple reasons. One being the pandemic. You might recall that the stay-at-home orders were issued pretty much the same week that the census came out and asking people to participate. Good thing that this time around it was online, so it made it a lot easier for people to participate. But the census was extended to make sure that they got everyone counted. So it was supposed to end at the end of July, and it went to October 15th, which is kind of far from April 1st, which is Census Day, and that's the day where you count where you are. It led to some headaches with group quarters population because a lot of kids came home from college in their school and were with mom and dad, but they should have been counted at their college and university. So there are some discrepancies with the data in terms of group quarters, but as we go through and do our analysis, we will be looking for that. Now, you might say Arlington doesn't have a lot of group quarters, but there are a lot of families, and they could have come home and stayed with their parents, and they could have been counted there instead of away at school. Another issue that has led to the delay is differential privacy. And you might have heard this at Northern Virginia Regional Commission meetings. We are working with fellow Northern Virginia demographers, trying to get a handle on this issue. Essentially, what it is that with the rise of computing, the rise of open data, information out there for public consumption, when you combine it with census data, there are opportunities to identify individuals. And that's a very serious thing for the Census Bureau because, the Census Bureau takes the privacy and security as one of their foundations. As you might recall that, data cannot be released for 72 years. So the new methodology used this time around to protect people's information is called differential privacy. And it's essentially adding noise to data that's at the sub-state level. And as you go down in your geography, so you start at the state, that's a big geography, go down to county, tract, block group, and then block. The smaller the geography, the less accurate the data is. So we're working with our Northern Virginia colleagues to understand what is this impact, how do we deal with it, how can we use the data for those small level geographies. And it's a hard concept to get and understand with. So this is an example that the University of Virginia, Weldon Cooper Center came out with in one of their blog posts. They said, in areas that had Black minority areas, which localities that were less than 2% of the population identified as Black in 2010, those areas showed an average of 74% growth in the Black population. Then if you look at Black majority areas, those showed an average of 6% decrease in the Black population. And what this is this is not a result of actual population shifts, but this is a result of the algorithm that has been applied to keep people's information secure. So with that, we have a population total of 238,643 in 2020. That is an increase of over 31,000 persons since 2010. If we look at our growth for the last 10 years, we grew by 14.9%, which is over double that of the national growth rate of 7.1. And I know you have heard me say before that since 1980, we have grown at a rate of 1% per year. This past 10 years shows we have grown at about 1.5%. So we had a higher growth rate over these past 10 years. Arlington's population increase accounts for 4.9% of Virginia's growth and accounts for 9.7% of growth of Northern Virginia. There were also some changes to the race and Hispanic or Latino origin question that can lead to changes in the data as well. The Census Bureau had changed the design and processing of this data. So in this statement from them, they say they're confident that the overall racial distributions are largely due to their changes in the questions and to their processing. But there are also some demographic changes that went on as well. I just want to review very quickly what those changes of the questions were. So this is the Hispanic origins question, and the changes was to that last checkbox, and they took out the word print origin. They took out the word origin, for example. They found that that word origin was very confusing to people, so they just said print, for example, and they got a whole lot of more responses that way. They also changed the 6 categories in that response to reflect changes in the Hispanic populations. If we look at the race question, there were about 7 changes that occurred to this question. Number 1, they wanted participants to mark one race and print their origins. And this was the first time you could print your origin if you were of white or Black or African American categories. They also provided 6 groups of white, Black, or African American, American Indian, and Alaska Native categories based on the largest populations in the country. The other thing that was changed was the word Negro was removed from the Black or African American category. The Asian and Native Hawaiian and other Pacific Islanders were reordered based on population size. Guamanian or Chamorro was changed to Chamorro. And then they also changed instructions on some other race to say print, race, or origin to align with the overall instructions. The Census Bureau changed how they coded race as well. So previously, the number of characters that you could put in the write-in was 30. That's up to 200 now. And they also coded the responses for 6 codes. So this graphic here is to help me explain what this means. Before, in 2010, that you could have up to 2 different codes for your race. Now you can have up to 6. So if you see start at the top, someone who responded they were Black, they have 1 code. White, Hispanic, Blanco, they have 3 codes, and it goes down. So you could have up to 6 this time. And this leads to our results by race. If we look at the white population, we came in at 58.9% white. And this is the lowest that the white population has ever been in Arlington, meaning conversely that the non-white population is the highest it's ever been in Arlington. So after the white population, the second highest are those of Hispanic or Latino origin at 15.7%, followed by the Asian population at 11.4%, and then the Black or African American population at 8.5%. And if we look at the growth over the last 10 years, I'm just going to go down this list and just highlight some things. The white population grew by 5%. That is only higher than the populations that declined. The American Indian, Alaska Native declined, and also Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islander declined. However, since they are such small populations, I'm not sure that this is an actual decline in the population or a differential privacy-induced decline. If we look at the Black or African American population, that increased by 19%. That's the first time that this population has increased since 1980. If we look at the Asian population, they had the overall highest number of people increase, increasing by over 7,000 and almost 38%. Those of some other race or 2 or more races had substantial increases, over double, and I think this is due to the fact of the form changes that we saw. And then those of Hispanic or Latino origin increased by 19.1%. If you maybe recall, from 2020 to 2010, we had a huge decrease in the Hispanic population, but now we're up and over the levels that we were in 2000. So I'm going to hand it over to Emily to talk about age.
Great. So as Elizabeth mentioned, this data release included population age 18 years and older. We were able to subtract the population 18 years and older from the total population to get the population under 18 years old, which is 42,080 people countywide. This age group grew by 9,454 persons, or a 29% increase since 2010. Arlington's population under the age of 18 years old had the largest increase in both number and growth rate since 1950 to 1960, but the total is still lower than the peak of 48,995 reported in the 1960 census. The percent of the population under 18 increased from 15.7% of the population in the 2010 census to 17.6% of the population in 2020. As you can see, the percent of population under 18 varies by race and ethnicity. The populations that I have identified as some other race, 2 or more races, or of Hispanic or Latino origin have much higher percentages of persons under the age of 18. Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islander, Asian, and white have the lowest percentage of persons under the age of 18. Overall, Arlington's population under the age of 18 grew twice as fast as the population 18 years and over. When broken down for each race, and those of Hispanic origin, only white population and those of Hispanic or Latino origin show the same trend. The growth in the white population under the age of 18 was over 6 times that of the white population 18 years and over. Those of Hispanic or Latino origin under the age of 18 grew twice as fast as those 18 years and over. The Asian, some other race, and those of 2 or more races had higher growth rates for the population 18 years and over compared to those under 18 years. In particular, the 18 years and over population that identified as some other race grew over twice as fast as the under 18 years population. The Black and African American population under 18 years grew at a rate of 18.6%. This is very close to the 18 years and over growth rate of 19% and can be considered to grow at the same rate. The American Indian or Alaska Native population are the smallest racial groups in Arlington, and when broken down by age, a slight change will result in a significant percentage change. In addition, the implementation of differential privacy can skew results for small populations, and it is difficult to determine if the change was statistically significant for these racial populations. The Census Bureau classifies all people not living in housing units as living in group quarters. A group quarters is a place where people live or stay in a group living arrangement that is owned or managed by an entity or organization providing housing and/or services for its residents. From 2010 to 2020, Arlington's group quarters population increased by 94 persons, from 2,892 in 2010 to 2,986 in 2020. For this census, the incarcerated population was counted differently. Instead of being counted in the location where they are incarcerated, they were counted where they lived prior to being incarcerated. The 2020 census reports Arlington to have 119,085 housing units, which is an increase of 13,681 units since 2010. Housing units are invariant and are not impacted by differential privacy. On the other hand, characteristics pertaining to housing such as vacancy and occupancy are impacted by differential privacy. Because of this, these numbers are preliminary and are subject to change upon the release of the detailed demographic and housing characteristic files to be released by the Census Bureau in 2022. A household is an occupied housing unit. Every person living in that housing unit is considered part of the same household. Arlington households well surpassed the 100,000 mark in the 2020 census, reaching 109,912. Over the last decade, 11,862 households were added to Arlington, the largest amount since the 1970 census. Arlington's average household size, or the number of people per household, has been between 2.07 and 2.12 since the 1980 census. The 2020 census reported a 2.14 average household size, increasing by 2.7% since 2010, and only the second time Arlington's average household size increased in its history. Here you can see our next steps. We will do a block level review comparing household units, total population, population by race, population by age, and average household size to the 2010 census results. We will also use the 2020 census data to evaluate and update our methodologies, including population estimates and the population forecast. And additionally, we will put together various data resources, including census tabulation tables for specific areas, including planning areas and civic associations, a series of briefing papers, and an interactive dashboard. In the meantime, 2 demographic dashboards are available online at arlingtonva.us/demographics. These dashboards utilize American Community Survey data and show various demographics countywide and by census tract.
Thank you both. Welcome, although you've been here for a little while, Ms. Garrett.
Thank you.
And I'm guessing we'll have at least one comment that is positive and so thankful for all that has been done. I'm sort of trying to, I think Ms. Crystal, having been the co-chair, but I think it's wise that the .02 that is not counted is not deducted or counted with respect to your great work for us. Thank you is the big thought, and certainly I think I've sent one note hoping for age data, and I know why that is going to come in due course down the road in 2022. But on behalf of all of us, a big thanks. If there's anything you wanted to add after getting through a very helpful slide deck, we will want the slide deck in addition to going to those 2 sites. That would be great. But a big thank you for all the work and the patience this afternoon. Thanks.
Mr. Chair, I'm going to present, I know Elizabeth won't like this, but, you know, Bryna had this on her car for a year, and we're going to give this to Elizabeth. Also, along with the, people wonder what happens to county board proclamations from the chair, but this is Dorsey's proclamation, so.
Aw. Well deserved. And thank you, Ms. Helfer, for adding that to perhaps the room that Ms. Hardy, or a room in Ms. Hardy's house, or here. Thank you both very much. Really appreciate it. And we'll take a look, and we will probably have additional questions, you know.
Thank you very much.
Sure. Thank you.
Last item, and certainly not least, but I want to thank Dr. Miller and Dr. Varghese for waiting. We have an update. I know that July was the last time that we actually did an update to the community, and that a lot has happened in the area of COVID. And I think that both Aaron and Ruben are going to walk through sort of a quick summary of where we stand on issues, and then I'm sure you'll have some questions. And I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Varghese to start.
Dr. Varghese.
I think it's now appropriate to say good evening, rather.
That's right. Good evening, not good afternoon, and we're sorry for that. Go ahead.
No, thank you. And I'm going to ask Ms. Jacobs' indulgence to pull up the familiar PowerPoint slide of the pandemic curve. I think I can start even without that up, but there it is. So I don't think it surprises anyone that I'm going to say that pandemic continues, and we are at high COVID transmission in Arlington and region and the state, and truth be told, in the entire nation. And so just to reorient everyone to the picture in the audience, this goes back to essentially March 2020 when the pandemic really began for Arlington. And obviously in April and May of 2020 was the first peak, which we suffered through, and unfortunately saw the most deaths occurring at that time, and we couldn't imagine something more awful. Unfortunately, we had the second peak coming in December and January. Fortunately, fewer deaths, but that isn't very comforting. We had a lot of disease in the community. And as things improved and hoped that the vaccine would actually change the situation, we did see improvement, but I think it is another thing to remind everyone that vaccine, while it's an important element in the strategies, it's not the cure-all. I think some people have gotten the mistaken impression that breakthrough infections was something unanticipated. And in fact, when the FDA originally approved the vaccines, the entire purpose was to reduce the risk for severe illness manifested by hospitalization and death. And from that perspective, it has actually been effective for the length of time. They have never said, and the CDC had that very clear, but it wasn't picked up, but they never said that there would be no infections. So I think that is something, but I get it. That in common parlance, the public will think of breakthrough as, any sort of infection. So we get it, and it's an important thing, and thank you, Dr. Miller, that we actually remind people that the vaccine can protect you from severe consequences, although it's not absolute, and you're still at risk for infection, and it's why we continuously talk about in public health that it's more than one strategy to try to reduce this. And I was going to actually ask the website gurus out there, I believe Kara's out there in the background, if you could actually pull up that website a little earlier than I was expecting to, since I made that transition to our slide on the web on the Swiss cheese model. I just wanted to make sure that people see what we're talking about. So this is a new graphic that staff created about reminding people a modification of Dr. McKay's work on the Swiss cheese model. And it basically says, use many strategies to slow the spread of COVID-19. Because the entire purpose of this is showing that no single strategy, no single Swiss cheese layer is perfect at preventing the spread of COVID-19. Each strategy has weaknesses or holes. However, the more you use together, overlapping layers blocks holes more and reduces how much COVID-19 may get through to you or to other people. And so obviously it's going to be my pitch. I'm going to put the health hat on right now. the more individuals who can do as many of these layers as possible, you're protecting yourself, you're protecting other people. And I know we want to return to normal. The way to return to more of normal is to allow more activities to occur, such as schools. Schools will remain open if there's less disease going into the schools. And that only happens if there's less disease in the community. So that is my fervent hope, is that people will try to do as best as they can to do as many of these layers all the time as individuals to reduce that, so that we actually can keep all of the essential things we need to do open in our community. And that's just something, and I think we've done that, and there's more to go. I think with that sermon there, I would like to go to the vaccine slide, the actual progress, so that I can review some of the good news first before I deliver some of the sobering other context. So we've made progress. We're at 78% vaccination with at least one dose in Arlington, and you know that a while back that wasn't as high. And I suspect that the number is even higher. While we've gotten the Maryland data, that didn't give us enough of a bump. The CDC had told us that roughly there could be 14,000 data points between Maryland and DC. We only got about 500 from the bump, so I'm putting out all hope that there's more of a bump from the DC District of Columbia data. The state of Virginia and the District of Columbia are working through the legal agreements to share data. This is happening across the nation. So I'm hoping it'll be better than this, but I have to admit, this is still pretty good. And so please don't get me wrong, I'm pleased overall. However, at this rate, though, among the eligible, we still have 22% of our population of adults who are unvaccinated. So while this is good, and we have 162,000 people who are vaccinated either fully or partially, that still leaves 45,000 people who are unvaccinated. So I think we have to sometimes remember percentages are great, but sometimes it's the magnitude of how many people still are out there that can, and from my concern, they're at higher risk than the vaccinated for infection, serious illness, hospitalization, and death. And I think that's the thing. How do we help people realize that risk is still there? And then, of course, it does impact our community. But I'm going to still talk about it. We can't hector people. It's a trust issue sometimes. And if we force it too much, we may win the battle, but lose the war. And you had earlier talked about building trust in communities and someone. How do you have that right balance? So I'm very grateful to Brian Helfer and the team that's been leading the CVC activities to try to keep this issue out in the forefront. And every week we are seeing more vaccination. It may not be at the level that people would love to see and getting to 100%. But I think we have to realize we have plenty of vaccine. We have over 30 sites in Arlington in a 26 square mile jurisdiction. I'm going to have a hard time believing physical access is the primary issue, but we know there could be functional issues like computer access, fear. But what I want to remind people is the vaccine is there. If the people listening who are vaccinated can convince other people in their lives who may not be, that's the likely best way to get that conversion to happen. Because it's not going to be me as a trusted agent or any of you ultimately. It is going to be the people most proximate to them. And that's why the more we can get the message out that the vaccine is safe, it actually prevents serious outcomes like hospitalization and death. That's very critical. And try to be gentle with people. I realize it can be frustrating, and I'm not saying I don't get frustrated as well. I would like this to go away and that you never see me for about 4 to 6 years. So, but I think that's one of the things that, how do we do that message? And so just to remind people, I think we've gotten to the enthusiasts. I've been telling people I'm roughly going for 84%. Where did I get that number? National data suggests that it could be up to 16% of the population who will never get the vaccine. I'd like to believe Arlington's better than that, but for the moment, let's start there. That would mean 84% of our eligible population could get it. We're actually not that far away. So we need to keep being steady. I'm not giving up on the 16, but we have to have incremental progress here. So I'm holding out hope, hopefully for folks, that I think we see hope here, and we just need to be consistently getting the message out and inviting people routinely to the opportunity to get vaccinated. I think I've said enough, so I'm going to let Dr. Miller or...
Sure, want to go to Dr. Miller, but if we can leave this page up, I think I'll have a question eventually on that, but, and maybe I'll just ask it now. The 22%, DC and Maryland are pieces, but the federal employees who may not yet be counted, am I guessing correctly that in that 22%, there's some percentage, perhaps more than 1%, but we don't know how big, that has been vaccinated but is still in the gray? Is that the right conclusion or not?
I think it's the right conclusion. What we don't know, though, is how much of the 14,000. We don't get really much information about the federal doses. We heard about Maryland and the district, which are different from necessarily the federal doses. So there's some degree of possibility, and they're trying to do agency by agency. I'm not sure why that has to happen that way, but if anyone can convince the federal government to tell all of their agencies you must share the data, that would be very helpful. But there are data quality issues. And Portsmouth was trying to find out what its rate was because of the historic nature of where they are. There are a lot of people who are stationed there but have not been there for years, and suddenly the population of vaccinated was greater than the actual number of people in the community. So that's why we have to look at the data to make sure that it actually is telling us what it needs. But that's why we're trying to work with the state. They're working gently to get that data as quickly as possible. So I'm holding out hope we'll see a bit more of a bump. I just can't tell you how much.
Thank you. That's helpful. Dr. Miller.
One of the key components that Dr. Varghese mentioned as part of the Swiss cheese model, and that you've heard us talk about since the beginning of the pandemic, has been testing, right? And so I wanted to just briefly provide an update on that, and then a refresher for those listening at home. So as a reminder, there are three main types of tests administered for detection of COVID: antibody tests, antigen tests, and what we call a diagnostic or in vitro, or sometimes may be referred to as a PCR test. Those three types of tests are designed to do very different things. The antibody test is designed to detect levels of antibodies in your immune system. It does not detect active infection. Antigen tests are designed to test for a specific protein in your blood, or in the body, that is a reaction created by your immune system and does detect active infection. And then again, what we refer to as the gold standard, the PCR test, generally sent to a lab. Throughout the pandemic, through Monday, we've had about 333,800 PCR tests reported to the Virginia Department of Health in Arlington County. Arlington County sites have provided about 84,500 of those tests, somewhere between 20 and 25%, which is where we've hovered for the majority of the pandemic. We have, since the beginning of September, seen what I would consider to be a record demand on our PCR testing sites. At the beginning of September, we were seeing almost 2,000 tests a day administered across Arlington, which is higher than we had seen at any time in the pandemic. We attribute that to, one, the return to school, two, the end of summer travel, and then some increases within local and state requirements for either proof of vaccination or a negative test to attend, for instance, events in the District of Columbia, or per employer requests as we see those mandates going in. Arlington still maintains 3 sites open to the public. Those are at Virginia Highlands Park, in the Courthouse Plaza parking lot, and at Arlington Mill Community Center. Those are open still 11 a.m. to 7 p.m. every day of the week. No appointment is necessary. However, it is encouraged. Easy to make online or by calling our COVID hotline, which can still help direct you through that process. No insurance is necessary at those sites, as a reminder, and no doctor's referral is necessary. They are PCR test administered at that site, so they are not same-day results. I am glad to say, though, that we are seeing about 36-hour turnaround. I used one on, 2 Saturdays ago. I actually visited the Arlington Mill site with my family. Everybody in the family, brother-in-law, sister-in-law were visiting from New Orleans, kids, everybody, 2-year-old with the PCR test, always an adventure. Received ours in about 36 hours. And my thanks, as always, to the public health staff and the other staff members who continue to work to support that access for our community. The Virginia Highland site was out of commission from September 17th. Tomorrow morning, it comes back online. It suffered some storm damage. And as a result, we didn't want to have staff at the site. We wanted to make the necessary repairs and make sure it was safe. So that comes back online tomorrow morning. So we wanted the community to know that. Test positivity rate, as Dr. Varghese mentioned, we do see an increase there. Still not record highs. Hovers around 3.3, 3.5% for the last 90-day period, and the last week period, I think, is somewhere around, refresh my memory, somewhere hovering between 3.5 and 4%. Numbers are escaping me right now. Which is indicative, as Dr. Varghese mentioned, of considerable amounts of community spread and higher than what we saw at some of the lowest points in the plateaus. So still a reminder that if you wake up and have a cough that you don't normally have, right, as part of your allergies, if you've got the sniffles, if your daughter who is in school, who is going to probably get sick, comes home with the sniffles, you should avail yourself of the available testing options. They are free, they're easy to access. We have language access there on site to help with folks. We want you to be able to know your status, protect yourselves, your family, and your community. It is an important part, even if you are vaccinated, because there are others in your life that may not be vaccinated. And as Dr. Varghese mentioned, you still have the ability to get sick, and we don't want folks unknowingly to be walking around sick. So, thank you.
Thank you for that report as well. Open to questions. I'm mindful of time. I do, just want to, there's a couple of different, maybe I have 2 big picture questions, if colleagues will indulge. And then I would say that amidst the challenge of Delta, we have just looked up again. We have hospitalizations, but we're seeing we're not losing as many Arlingtonians. Maybe 3 or 4 over the last. Any is too many, but 3 or 4 over the last 90 days. But is there a way to succinctly describe sort of? We don't know yet on 5 to 11-year-olds. That process is ongoing, and the same is true for a more robust. For our seniors. Can you speak to those 2 issues kind of briefly as far as boosters, because I know there's folks interested, but just wanted to touch on those very briefly.
Okay, no, excellent questions. So I'll take the 5 to 11 category. The best we know right now is that Pfizer is getting ready to provide their data to the FDA, the publicly available information of the media. The expectation is that should be submitted sometime by the end of September, which means that the FDA has to pull its advisors together to review things. And what we understand about their process, just to reassure everyone else as well, is they are going to pull more people off of other approvals so that they can fast track the review of the material. So it is not that they are rushing the review. But that does mean, in a sense, some people may say the pipeline for other medications and vaccines may not move as quickly because they are actually shifting staff to review this so that they can say they've crossed every T and crossed every I is, dotted every I. I'm cross-eyed apparently. So that they can actually reassure the public, one, process had been maintained, as well as, given that it's about children, I've said it before, we apply even stricter standards for making sure the vaccine is safe for children. And this is not a COVID-related phenomenon. This has been true for any vaccine prior for children. So if that happens, hopefully it'll be approved by the end of October, but that's one of the things that we've always been very bad at, is how to predict what's actually going to happen. All of it's the timing of whatever information happens, and that would be Pfizer. And then we don't know when companies like Moderna and Johnson & Johnson may be submitting those things, because they are trying to cross their T's and dot their I's. And so I know a number of people are frustrated, but we know that there have been some adverse events or side effects, like with young men having some more indications of myocarditis, heart inflammation that went away. So how do you balance it so that we go to that trust issue, that people know that the process was maintained and it's as safe as we can say it is for the public? So there's that. The FDA panel did recommend having certain groups get the possibility of boosters, and that was those over 65 and those with underlying chronic medical conditions, those 16 and older, for the Pfizer product. The FDA has not come out yet and said that they're going to approve that. We're anticipating they'll make a decision sometime this week. If that happens, it'll then go to the CDC and their advisory group to say, you know, which populations would they officially consider. If that all happens, then the group that had originally gotten Pfizer would be eligible for those things. And the fortunate thing is a number of the folks who got, the elderly who got the initial vaccine, especially nursing homes, it was more likely to be Pfizer than not. So that could be an option. What we'll also have to see is, will CDC say, in the cases of those who are eligible under the general criteria of over 65, will they say it's acceptable for a person who got Moderna to also get Pfizer? I can't predict that right now, and I realize people are probably waiting for that. There are pros and cons to those things, and so that's why they have to weigh through that, and let's see what the experts actually show or say. But I want to remind everyone, it's not like suddenly the immunity turns off. And so we are, in one sense, this may not be the best analogy, but we've been building the plane as we're flying it. There was no choice. It's safe, but we don't know how long the immunity lasts, and there's only one way we're going to learn that, over the passage of time.
Thank you. That's very helpful. On big questions on, you'll be waiting, and Virginia Department of Health, and then we will wait on seniors till the CDC acts. FDA is act, but we need the CDC too. So those are two big categories. I know it's a continuing source of concern. We continue to work our way through this difficult challenge. Thank you both for waiting, for being here this afternoon, and for providing us the update. Unless there are burning questions from colleagues, we will. Yes, Mr. Dorsey.
Thank you. Just a quick one. Dr. Varghese, are you getting any sense of whether or not we're seeing the normal uptake for flu vaccinations this year? And should we take this as an opportunity to do as you so ably do, to always remind people to not forget about that upper respiratory ailment as we're dealing with COVID?
Thank you for that terrific segue and opportunity. Yes, we still believe that flu shots are going to be critical this year as well, and especially as people are interacting. So one, make sure you make the opportunity to get your flu shot. They are already starting to arrive, and so there should be ample supply. And for those who are concerned, you can, the CDC has said you can get both the coronavirus vaccine and the flu shot at the same time, so you don't need to delay things. So you do not want to get COVID, you do not want to get flu, you do not want to get both of them, okay? So please get vaccinated, and all those other layers will also help reduce the risk from flu.